Hello, Garland Nixon here with Joti Brar, and the European economy is crumbling and the people are looking for answers. And I think we have someone that may be able to provide some. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here with Joti Brar, and it's been a few weeks. Everyone's been busy with the holidays and all kinds of important things going on. Joti, of course, she's got an entire country to run. Actually, if she was running the entire country, they certainly wouldn't have many of the problems they have, especially imperialism. But until such time as that happens in the very near future, we've got to figure out what the heck is going on and why. Joti Brar, welcome back to my humble YouTube channel.
Hi, Garland. Happy New Year to you.
All right, let's get starting here. You know, you look at, from the outside in, I look at the EU and I think to myself, they're insane. You know what I mean? I look at the ruling class and I'm like, let's see. They just cut themselves off of more gas, which means things are going to be expensive. I'm watching videos. I watched a video yesterday with this woman who's in the UK, and she said, if you're in the UK and you can afford it, get out. That was her message. If you can afford to get out and go as far as you can, right? You're looking at the US basically saying to the ruling elite of Europe, yeah, wipe out your economy, and if you can, start a war with Russia and get destroyed. And you just look at it and you say, this is irrational. It's illogical. But in a way, it has to be rational and logical. They wouldn't be doing it. There's some sense to be made of it. It's just things that fools such as myself can't figure out. So enlighten me. What the bloody heck is going on with these crazy people destroying their own economy? And one last thing. And because I got to add this, because this is an integral part of this discussion. Macron, the opposition wins, and he says, never mind. We're not going to practice any democracy here. Germany, the AfD, whoever the heck it is, they look like they're ahead, and the Germans are like, yeah, I guess we'll have to outlaw that party. Romania, hey, this guy won. Well, the court said, no, he didn't. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. Color revolution attempts. It's crazy. South Korea, they decide that they're going to do a martial law all of a sudden. That kind of fell apart. The mask seems to be coming off in desperation. Joti Brar.
My gosh, I'm just writing down some things so I don't forget everything you've said to me there. Let's start with this question of the decline of the economy and the apparent irrationality of the decisions that are being made by politicians. So fundamentally, if you want to understand what's happening, you have to understand that we're in a period of very deep and becoming deeper all the time global economic crisis of capitalism. It's a global overproduction crisis caused by the inherent workings of the capitalist system of production for profit, which we've talked about many times before, so I won't try and sum it all up again. But fundamentally, it creates a contradiction in the system whereby the people who constitute the market for goods become steadily more and more impoverished and less able to buy the very goods that they themselves created. The working class created all the goods that have to be bought. The working class can't afford to buy the goods. And fundamentally, it's the masses of the world who are the market. The market can't be sustained just by the super rich buying luxury goods. Has to fundamentally be fueled by workers buying ordinary goods of consumption to stay alive. The more they become impoverished, the less of a market they are. But at the same time they're becoming impoverished, the logic of capitalist production for profit is you have to constantly expand production and produce more and more and more. And that is impelled by the competition between capitalists. So to win the competition against other capitalists, any particular concern must grow, must outcompete its rivals, must learn to produce cheaper. And when you learn to produce cheaper, you usually do it through mechanization. And in that process, you produce more. So there's this exponential drive to produce more and more and more. And the advances in productivity are massive. But the market, i.e. the ability of people to buy the goods being produced, cannot keep up with the rate at which production expands. So this is why Marxists call this a problem of overproduction. A huge amount is being produced, but the way it's produced, part of which is that the workers get paid as little as possible, and the employers employ as few people as possible. All of that creates a situation where you have all these goods, you have a glut in the markets, and the goods can't be sold because there's no one who can afford to buy them. That's at the root of the problem. And if people sometimes look around and say, well, I can afford to buy things, or that doesn't seem like that's true, you have to look at it now as a global situation. You know, there may be pockets of people who can still afford to live okay, but increasingly that's not even true in the rich countries. And globally, the mass workforce of the planet is becoming more and more and more impoverished and unable to buy and provide itself with the basic necessities of a bare existence. So this is the very root of the problems in the world today. And many of the strange effects that we see in our economies, like asset bubbles, you know, massive speculation on things like housing or stocks or artworks, all of this is a symptom of the fact that there's not enough profit to be made by investing. There's so much capital has been amassed, Garland, in the hands of the super rich. And for them, capital is only capital if it can be reinvested at a profit. So they're desperate to make profits with all this money they've amassed. It's hard to make profits out of production when there's not a good market out there. So they have this problem. And so you get this speculation and gambling and a constant passing of money between, you know, members of the rich, and constant kind of schemes of sucking wealth out of the rest of the population. And you can see a sort of crypto. Most of the cryptocurrencies are basically Ponzi schemes. They are ways of setting up something that you know, looks as if it's making a lot of money, that everybody, you know, poor people throw their money into in the hopes that they're going to get rich too. But of course, they're just giving their money to the super rich, the people who set the thing up. You know, like any Ponzi scheme, it only pays the original investors, who were the ones who already had money. And all the poor suckers who threw their money in thinking it was a get rich quick scheme find it was a get very poor scheme very quickly. So, you know, all of this is a symptom. These are all symptoms. And the problem with the global crisis of overproduction is you can't simply export your way out of it. Back in the days when British capitalism was the only major industrial power on the planet, it was constantly, every time it had an economic crisis, one of the levers it used to bring back demand to the market was to expand the market, to go abroad and conquer new markets to sell its goods into, and new sources of raw materials to pull into its industry and fuel that process. You can't do that when the whole of the world has become part of the same basically integrated imperialist economy. You can only do it by dislodging forces that control other markets. That might be forces that have become independent. In the modern world, there are parts of the globe which are not controlled and completely dominated by imperialism. So, you know, a big drive is to dislodge those governments, those systems, and replace them with outright, you know, looting, and expand your markets, expand your locus of control. And of course, in this desperate situation, desperate for capital, because of course, if they can't keep making profits, they go under, they go down. So to maintain their system and maintain their place in the system, there's a desperate struggle between sections of the ruling class. And we have monopoly ruling classes, monopoly financiers in all the major imperialist powers, who, on the one hand, because of the world we now live in, the post the beginning of socialism world, the post-October Revolution world, and especially the post-World War II world order, where the imperialist powers had really weakened themselves. We live in a situation where the imperialists have really been forced to band together to keep the system going at all. You know, this is a system that was rotten and ripe for overthrow more than 100 years ago. When Lenin wrote his book explaining imperialism, which is global monopoly capitalism, how it works and why it is the eve of the revolution of the working class, it's bringing about all the conditions for its overthrow. It's completely decadent and decaying. This system has been ripe for revolution for more than 100 years. And it's only been kept going by, you know, really the power of American imperialism has kept it going through 2 world wars that essentially destroyed the power, the independent power of the European old imperialist powers. They have been kept going by the power of the US economy and the US military. But it creates contradictions within the imperialist camp. So they banded together to stave off the socialist revolution, which was knocking at the door everywhere. In the 1920s and 30s, it was knocking at the door even in the USA. You know, they had to do a lot of fancy footwork to stop that movement and buy off its leadership and bring down the levels of discontent, everything from the New Deal to, you know, kind of buying off communist leaders, to criminalizing the ones who couldn't be bought off and all the rest of it. You know, a whole load of moves in the USA to stop the communist movement, the socialist movement in its tracks. But they had a lot of resources to be able to do that, and American imperialism was still a kind of strong power. But everywhere else, it was really with American help that the revolution was stopped across Europe. And so they've been in an anti-communist, anti-socialist alliance ever since the end of World War II. And that has to be really understood. You can't understand the modern world unless you realize that imperialism is in decay and decline, and that the imperialist powers entered into an alliance against the rising power of the masses, against socialism and national liberation. After World War II, they essentially stopped fighting each other and started to help each other in order to survive, for the system to survive against the onslaught of the rising tide of communism and national liberation. So we're in this huge crisis of overproduction again. And because of the crisis of overproduction, we see the ruling class desperately looking around for ways to maintain and increase profitability in a situation of declining profitability. So what are the things they do? They are looking for any way possible to pass the burden of the crisis onto the poor. So that means, of course, they cut jobs because that's a way to increase profitability. You know, you see mergers and acquisitions always accelerate during these periods of crisis. And it's so that the capitalists, you know, can try to win the battle of competition against one another in a situation where there's not enough market to go around between them all. So you try and capture more of the market by making your company bigger. And as you make your company bigger, you get more economies of scale in your production. And what that means is you can produce more with more machinery and fewer people. So with all of these processes, you have more unemployment, which also means, of course, that the market for goods also shrinks because more people are poor and unemployed, right? So the means the ruling class finds to escape the crisis actually fuel the crisis, right? They will impose more and more austerity onto all the kind of social provision in society. But what does that mean? Not only does it mean people's lives get worse because their healthcare is disappearing and getting worse, and their education is disappearing and getting worse, and all the social services and housing, whatever they might have had, disappearing, getting worse. But all the people who were being paid to provide those services are being made redundant, you know, in round after round after round. So guess what? More people on the dole, more people needing services and not getting them, fewer people with money in their pocket to spend in the market, the crisis getting worse. And of course, anger amongst the masses of the people rising. Okay, because their lives are getting worse all the time. They work harder and they get less, and so we see that inequality grows exponentially during these periods. And that, of course, also fuels anger, because nothing screams injustice at a human being so much as rampant inequality. It's something that we are acutely sensitive to and tuned into. And, it's so in your face, isn't it, in this society, how massively unequal the world is and each individual society is. And of course, that fuels people's sense of anger, frustration, resentment, and their desire to change the world, find a way to make things better, to make things fair, and of course, what we also see is, I talked a bit earlier, but we have to also always recognize that this desperate fight amongst capitalists to stay capitalist, which means to either get bigger and win the battle of competition, constantly works to put those in the lower ranks of capital out of business. So again, the big fish eat the small fish. This is a law of capitalism, always and constantly. And through history, the big fish get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and becoming, kind of globally big, because that's a historical process, right? And as long as capitalism exists, that's the direction it's going in. That's why we now live in the era of decaying monopoly capitalism, because capitalism long ago stopped being a system of many competing capitals. And in each sphere of the economy, you now have 2 or 3 humongous companies that basically control the entire world market in that particular area of economic activity or good production. So the big eating the small and inequality growing, these are the symptoms of the situation that we're in today, and the fueling of inequality and the rising anger that all of that provokes, even amongst smaller capitalists. Even some quite big capitalists start to feel angry and resentful because they're not big enough to survive this battle of competition against the titan behemoths of massive global monopoly capital. So you start to hear from different strands of the population, different types of expressions of frustration and anger with the current situation, and resentment against the activity of the monopolists who control everything, including, of course, the governments and the media. And that becomes increasingly clear to people over the last 20 years, that the monopolies control the government and the media and not the other way around, right? Which for a long time people imagined it was the other way. We elect the government and the government bosses all the companies around. No. Now it becomes more and more obvious to people that isn't true, right? That was a fairy tale. And you were talking about rationality, that why would it be that the governments in Europe would take decisions that shoot their own businesses in the foot? Well, of course, you can only understand that if you understand 2 things. The first is they are acting according to the logic of capital, not according to the logic of human beings, right? And we cannot assess the behavior of capital according to the logic of humanity, because it doesn't work. You have to first look at it from the point of view of capital. And in this era, it's the point of view of the highest, the biggest monopoly capital. And the contradiction comes because the section of the population that benefits from the control by monopoly capital is tiny. And even, like I said earlier, there's many quite big even capitalists who don't benefit from the world being set up in order to serve the biggest monopoly financier capitalists. But tough shit, baby, that's capitalism. There is no way out of that. There's no way to bring it back down to a level. And who's going to set the level of competition that's acceptable, or the size of business that's acceptable and fair? What would make it a level? There's no such thing as the level playing field in capitalism. Right from the very beginning, there was a skewed playing field, and became more skewed as time went by the very nature of how capitalism works to concentrate wealth. And concentrating wealth inevitably means dispossessing huge numbers of people. The very existence of the capitalist system presupposes a massive load of people who've been dispossessed. Because what the flipper is the working class, Garland? How did it come to be that there's a whole load of people who cannot feed themselves or their children unless they sell their ability to work to somebody else, who can exploit their labor power and make a profit out of it? Like, were we, did Adam and Eve come out of the, did the people come out of the jungle and immediately someone had money and was an exploiter and the other one had no ability to eat? No, you go into the Amazon rainforest to a tribe and put some gold coins in someone's hands, and will it change anything? Of course it won't. Of course it won't, because the other people don't need to sell their labor power to the guy with the pretty gold coins in his hand. They know how to hunt and fish. They've got the jungle all around them. They know how to make shelter. They've got all the things they need to survive. They have not been dispossessed. This is a historical process that takes place, during the whole course of class society, whereby society is divided between those who have a monopoly ownership of all of the ways in which the tools and the land and the things you need in order to feed yourself and your family and the rest of your community, and those who don't. And the ones who don't will either starve in a ditch or sell themselves to the people who can make money out of their labor. Capitalism arises at a certain point in the development of human society. And when you understand that it arose out of historical conditions, you can also understand that historical conditions are creating the basis for it to also be superseded by a different type of social organization, a different way of supplying human beings' wants, right? So capitalism is not some eternal representation of humanity and human nature and human society. It is a historical development that could only come about after certain other conditions had been met, and has itself created conditions for its own replacement by something new, because it's brought into being two forces that it can't actually control. It's brought into being, number one, the modern proletariat, the working class, which has literally nothing except its ability to work, no stake in the system, but which does all the work, which creates all the wealth, and is also brought into being huge productive forces which have the capability of providing a really decent life and a rising, exponentially and constantly rising quality of life for every single person on the planet. There's no justification anymore for classes. Not only that, the existence of classes is holding back the progress of society and the ability to really use these modern machines. These modern machines under capitalism constantly lie idle. All the things they could make for us, they're not making. Why? Not because there's no one to work the machine, not because we don't have raw materials and energy to power the machine, because we don't have people to buy what the machines are producing. What kind of absurdity is that? We've got everything we need to produce and supply people with what they want, what they need, and for their needs to rise and be catered to, and for life to get really good. We can't use them while they're in the hands of a teeny tiny exploiting class whose only reason for existence is to make a profit. And if those means of production can only work when they're making profit, a lot of the time they're not working. And very often, in order to bring back demand for the market, what happened in World War I and World War II was the only way now for the imperialist, which is global capitalism, for the global capitalist system to restart demand is to destroy means of production, destroy these huge machines that are capable of giving a good life to people, destroy power plants, destroy infrastructure, destroy houses and hospitals and all these things that we've spent all these riches and effort to create, destroy people. And all of that is necessary to give a kickstart to the economy, to bring back a bit of profitability, to give us a little bit of a, give the capitalists a little bit of a boom time again. And at the end of it, they'll land back in the same ditch and be demanding the same sacrifice of the people. And the sacrifice is a blood sacrifice. I mean, you couldn't get anything more barbaric than dying decadent imperialism in terms of the incessant and industrial scale of blood sacrifice it demands from the people of the world in order to continue existing. And it continuing existing is literally just to service the profit thirst of this tiny section of the global financier, monopoly ruling class. It is intrinsically irrational, as you said, Garland. From any logical human point of view, everything about the situation humanity is now in is totally and utterly illogical. But it does, as you say, have a logic, and the logic is the logic of capital. So when we look at Germany taking these decisions, we have to understand that the very top financiers in Germany will be benefiting from these decisions, or they wouldn't be being taken. And part of the calculus is also to do with their relationship with the USA. There's a lot of talk in the USA, in Germany right now, about whether it's possible for German imperialism to have a separate existence from that of US imperialism, whether the price of staying allied is too great. But Germany is not a vassal of the USA, but the German financiers, like the British financiers and the French financiers, took a decision after World War II that the way to survive as global financiers was in partnership with the USA. They simply didn't have the same strength as they had had before World War I and before World War II, particularly, as I said, in the face of the rising tide of global communism. So, yes, it's irrational, but yes, there is a logic to it. And we have to understand that that's, as a friend of mine used to say, that's dialectics, comrade. Something can be one thing and its opposite at the same time, and you have to understand the different forces at play. And just very quickly, because you also asked about this, so sorry, I've been talking a long time.
No, continue, because I threw a bunch of questions at you at the same time. So you
asked about democracy, and of course the question of democracy and fascism, which is essentially, they are twins. They're two sides of the same coin. Bourgeois democracy and fascism are two tactics of the ruling class, depending on the social situation that they're facing. The ruling class in capitalist society prefers to rule through what they call the velvet glove of democracy. They prefer for it to look as if they're ruling by mass consent, as if they prefer to present the system as if it represents, and the state as if it represents the will of the whole people, and we're all in this together, and everyone's in his rightful place, and everyone has a chance to get on, and all those fairy tales they tell us, right? It's much preferable it's a better condition for exploitation, in fact, that people are willing wage slaves and willingly participate in the system and believe in the myths of the system, that it's democratic, that the people in parliament represent the people, blah, blah, blah. We have a free press, etc. But the problem is, as I said earlier, this is a system that generates crisis, and it cannot help generating crisis. You can't legislate this crisis out of capitalism because it is intrinsic to capitalist production for profit. And I know I say these things often, but you have to really understand it, that there isn't a way to argue this crisis out of existence, or to legislate against it, or to make capitalism fair. All these problems are intrinsic to producing for profit. So we have this crisis of overproduction, and it's creating social chaos. And therefore, democracy, even in the imperialist countries, is becoming weaker and weaker, because there is a deep and deepening crisis of illegitimacy. The people are less and less susceptible to the velvet glove. They don't believe in the media, the politicians, the police, the judiciary, all the institutions of the state that they formerly looked up to and respected. They're losing their respect for, they're losing their faith in the entire setup. They're starting to angrily demand change. Now, what does a ruling class do in this situation? It turns to increasingly authoritarian measures to keep the poor in their place so they can carry on looting, because they can't accede to their demands, Garland. You know, at a time of crisis, when every public service has to be privatized and opened up to profiteering because the profiteers are desperate for profits, right? The sources of profit are drying up, and they have to cannibalize absolutely everything, no matter what social chaos that creates, right? And what anger that creates for the people, what difficulties it creates. They will, you know, again, from a human point of view, it's illogical and crazy. But from the point of view of capital, it's just necessary. It is simply necessary, because otherwise capitalism is going to collapse, right? It's going to implode. They have to keep finding ways to generate profitability, and that means cannibalizing. You know, as you've talked about this sense that the whole state is being cannibalized, and you know, every bit of public service and infrastructure is being destroyed for profit. And at the same time that happens, you're generating more and more social unrest and anger, but they can't not do it, because if they didn't do it, then the massive crash of their markets that they fear would come sooner. So you can see it that they're constantly finding mechanisms to kick the can down the road, hoping there's a way to save their bacon if they can just extend the period before this inevitable huge crash that's comes. Maybe something can save us. You know, maybe Russia will collapse and we'll get to loot Russia. Maybe this will happen. Maybe that will happen. Maybe something will happen. Something will turn up, right? So kick the can down the road, borrow money to pay out dividends to your shareholders, so it looks as if you're still making profits, right? And then do this and do that. You know, all these things are fueling how bad the crisis is actually, and how huge the crash is going to be when it comes. But in the meantime, it's just kick the can down the road for, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, till after the election, till this, till that. In that situation, the velvet glove of bourgeois democracy is ever less able to do its job, and authoritarian means are needed. And so we're seeing, in the colonies, in the oppressed world, authoritarian means are the rule. They're not the exception. You only have to read the history of the British Empire, the history of any colonized country, how vicious the regime of suppression of the masses and the machinery of looting the wealth and exploiting the labor power of those people has been, to understand that democracy was not something that the imperialists have ever been interested in really exporting, right, in a meaningful way, in terms of actually letting the people express their genuine desire for freedom and liberation. No. They'll set up fake democracies in this era of national liberation. They're forced to do that. But as far as possible, and whenever they're able, rule by brute force and with the most dictatorial fascistic methods has been the rule and not the exception. But in the imperialist countries, to enable them to carry on their vicious ventures abroad, they need to create social peace at home. They need to have acceptance at home of the way they behave abroad. And the best way to do that is to bribe the workers at home, to make them feel a bit special, to make them feel like, well, we're civilized. We have democracy. We're just kind of better than the people elsewhere. And the way they live, and the way that, the kind of the vicious regimes and the corrupt regimes they have, we don't have that sort of thing, because we're just special. We're just more civilized. And if you can persuade the people at home by their conditions of life that they are better and different, and they should identify with their ruling class, and that we as a nation, we in Britain, we in the USA are the bearers of civilization, and we know how to live, You basically do that by bribing people with a better standard of life, and then they keep quiet and look the other way when you're busy plundering the rest of the world, because they're getting kickbacks from it and because they don't relate to the suffering of the people elsewhere. And you can hide it from them. They're looking the other way. They're busy living their nice life. So South Korea, is a slightly different case than France, for example. South Korea is a colony of the USA and has been a direct colony of the USA since it liberated itself from Japanese fascist occupation during World War II. So South Korean people have never had democracy. They've had a kind of fake proxy democracy now and again during the period of their colonization, but very often they've had direct fascistic dictatorship, which has always, but whether they had a kind of fake democracy or direct fascistic dictatorship, all of those governments were actually completely in service of the US occupation forces. There was no independence. There was no ability really for the Korean people in the South to express their genuine will. But in France, it's a slightly different situation in that the kind of scrapping of, bourgeois democratic norms is seen as much more shocking to the working classes in the imperialist countries. They've got used to believing that they have democracy. And so the moves towards increasing authoritarianism across the imperialist world will, on the one hand, they're fueled by the need to keep the masses under control and keep the profits going and the war drive going. And on the other hand, they in themselves are further fueling the crisis because of the anger that they will provoke.
Interesting. One of the things I was, going to, throw this at you. One of the things that's discussed is neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right? And it was, and this is the narrative. Everything was trundling along nicely in the 60s and 70s, right? Going nicely. Capitalism was nice and smooth. People were living well in certain regions, right? And then that darn Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan invented something completely new called neoliberalism. And with this brand new bastardization of a perfectly well-oiled machine called capitalism, then it was, well, we're just going to straight out right in front of your faces and say the way we're going to do things is deregulation, which is get rid of all of the restrictions for corporations and the powerful. And we're going to do tax cuts for the rich and give all the way. So we're going to just right out in front of your face, take all of the money and give it to the rich and say, everybody will be better off if we do everything to benefit the super wealthy capitalist, right? Okay. Here's the part that I want to ask you about. It seems to me that that's a fraud for this reason. They redefined what they were already doing. They didn't come up with the implication is we had a perfect system of capitalism and they took it in a bad direction. And that's why everything went bad. That if we'd have just kept doing what we were doing in the 60s and 70s, it would have been fine. But because they took us in a bad direction, things aren't working to me and working. And it seems to me they didn't change direction at all. That's the direction things were going. And they simply gave it a renamed it to hopefully get the working class on board a little bit more so they could continue. Anyway, your thoughts on this whole concept of neoliberalism as being a totally different system of capitalism, a hyper capitalism, as opposed to a redefinition of what the heck was already going on. Joti.
Thanks, Garland. This whole discourse, to use a very annoying academic term, I think really relies on people having an exceptionally short historical memory. And it's like 1945, the end of World War II, was the beginning of history. But if you want to talk about this is, you know, this is an abomination, and this is not how well-oiled capitalism works, just look at 1950 and 1960. I would say to you, look at 1930. Look at 1830. That was capitalism acting as capitalism acts naturally. The historical anomaly was the post-World War II couple of decades. And we've talked before about how those 3 decades came about. These massive concessions made not just to a small section of the working class, which imperialism had for a long time been making concessions and bribing a small section of the working class in order to make them loyal to the state and the system. And this, Lenin called this section of the working class, the labor aristocracy. And he showed how they had a material interest in keeping the system going. And so they were loyal to the ruling class and loyal to the system. And this explained the behavior of the leaderships of the working class at certain crucial times in working class history, that they were actually loyal to imperialism. But the mass of the workers before 1945 lived, even in the richest imperialist countries, in utter destitution. Utter destitution, Garland. And you only have to read Karl Marx's Capital, which is basically a brilliant history of the British working class, among other things, to understand why that was and how that was, and see in the most graphic and horrendous detail the waste of life for the mass of the poor workers, even through the most prosperous times for capitalism. And even as Britain was the workshop of the world and was expanding throughout the world, huge numbers of workers, suffered enormously. The Great Depression. It's amazing to me how few people ever talk about the Great Depression and talk about that this is capitalism. This was the first ever really, well, maybe not, maybe the second, because after World War. So the first big global overproduction crisis led to World War I. And very soon after World War I, you got the next one, which was bigger and deeper still, which led to World War II. But before World War II, the entire world that wasn't socialist, because remember, by this point, we had the USSR. In the USSR, the people's lives, the production, there was no false lid on productivity of industry, because there was no production for profit, or that production for profit was being steadily brought down, and planned production was expanding. And Soviet industry and Soviet agricultural production during the period where the rest of the world was suffering the Great Depression, Soviet output was going like this. And the wages of the workers in the Soviet Union were rising like this, and their working days were getting shorter, right? And their lives were blossoming, with education, with healthcare, with culture, with housing, with, social meaning. Everything that it takes to have a really decent life was developing exponentially and incredibly rapidly in the Soviet Union at the same time as the rest of the world was plunged into the most hideous overproduction crisis that had ever been seen until today, right? That was what led to World War II, that overproduction crisis and all the contradictions in it, and the fight over profitability, markets, and colonies, was what drove the powers to begin World War II. It changed its character, that war, after the Soviet Union was attacked, and then the workers of the world were mobilized on the side of the Soviet Union essentially to defend the Soviet Union from fascism. That was the core element of that war. But what drove the British and the Germans and the French initially into the war was a fight, just like World War I, over colonies, over profits, right? Because of the overproduction crisis. So that period after World War II, where the mass of the working class was given huge concessions and benefits to stop them making a socialist revolution like they were seeing, had done so much for the workers of the Soviet Union and had enabled the Soviet Union to defeat fascism at a tremendous, tremendous cost, but had enabled the planned economy, industrialization and collectivization of agriculture and all the education of the masses, all those things had enabled the Soviet people to defeat fascism in Europe. And to buy off the threat of socialist revolution and to resuscitate imperialist powers that were on their knees in Europe, huge concessions were made to the working classes in the West, which went beyond the labor aristocracy to benefit the entirety of the working class. We have come to imagine that this is the normal workings of capitalism, that the mass of the workers should have a decent life. But it isn't, Garland. There's nothing normal about it. It was totally synthetic. It was a peace deal that was made in very specific circumstances. And those circumstances came to an end in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the post-war reconstruction boom was over and capitalist overproduction crisis was starting to reassert itself. And so Thatcher, Reagan, these were figureheads for the ruling class as it changed its tack. It changed its tack because of its economic situation. It was no longer willing or able to pay for such big social service provision of all kinds at a time when profits were starting to dry up in the productive sphere of the economy. So they needed privatization and they needed to bring down the public spending, bring down taxation, and all of those things which we call neoliberalism, but which are just the capitalists reverting to type and saying, look, this time of the peace bargain is over. But, you have to be a bit strategic about the way you present it to the working class. You don't just say, oh, well, we call time on our peace deal with you. You don't tell them that, do you? What you do things like, we saw it in Britain and, they do it. They have a brilliant formula for privatizing a public service in Britain. They start to starve it of funds. And then they start to impose all kinds of rules on it that make it difficult for it to operate properly. And then when it's a bit crumbly and creaky and it's not operating in a very good way, and you get all these diatribes from politicians and media about how it doesn't function properly, and they will blame it on bureaucracy. They'll say, oh, what it needs is to be agile, and you can only get that from the market. What we need is private investment to come and shape it up and make it kind of, and it's a whole load of absolute guff. But the point is, they create a public perception of this important public service that the service cannot be fixed under conditions of national ownership. It's going to have to be privatized. So they make the service shit, basically, and they create in people's minds the feeling that, well, you might as well sell it off because it's rubbish, isn't it? Then they sell it off, and of course people discover that what they get is much, much worse, because now they're paying through the nose for a much worse service. And every time it needs investment for infrastructure, it has to be renationalized, or that the infrastructure has to be subsidized, or something has to be done, because in fact we have to guarantee the profits for the people who run the services. So the whole point is not to make services better, as the narrative always is in the media. They always tell us, and the politicians, what we want to do is improve your health service, improve your roads, improve your hospitals, improve your care for the elderly, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't want to improve anything. They want to find a way to open it up to profit making, to turn these things into businesses and, create a situation where instead of paying taxes directly for the provision of a service, we pay taxes that are kind of funneled straight out to private corporations who will employ a few people on very bad paying conditions to try and provide a shoestring service, but will mainly lap up a huge amount of what we've given them in dividends for their shareholders. So, this is all, symptoms of the overproduction crisis. What they call neoliberalism, this this financialization of the economy, for example. Well, what was that except for, a further development of an ongoing process of deindustrialization? This phenomenon is something that Lenin identified as being already far advanced in Britain back at the turn of the 20th century. Because capital always goes where the profits are highest, and you can make more profit setting up production in a country far away where the land is cheap, the labor is cheap, the government is weak, unions are weak, and environmental regulations are weak, etc., etc. You'll make much more profit setting up a brand new production facility there than you will reinvesting in brand new machinery for your factory at home. So they mothball the factory at home, lay off the workers, send the production elsewhere. This is a process that has been going on in Britain since the 19th century. In the post-World War II period, it really accelerated, and particularly, again, after the Reconstruction boom, after Britain lost some of her remaining colonies as well, because British industry, the industry that was still going on in Britain domestically, had become super uncompetitive, precisely for the reason I just said. When Britain had this huge empire, goods that were made by British industry in Britain were not being made on the most advanced machines. They were being made on Victorian machines. And if they'd been exposed to just an open world market, all those businesses would have gone out of business a long time earlier, or they'd have been forced to update their machinery, 100 years earlier. But because they had a closed market of the colonial world, the British Empire was huge. And that gave Britain a monopoly on all those markets. So British industry could keep selling uncompetitive goods to a controlled market that didn't have a choice. They could keep products from other countries out of those markets. Well, after World War II, they had less and less ability to do that. They were kicked out of their colonies. And although they retained neocolonial relationships with a lot of those colonies, like Kenya, for example, is one, they had to compete with the USA in all the markets, and with Japan, and with, Germany. And Japan and Germany were reindustrialized by the USA after World War II, really as a kind of another anti-communist measure. It was very important for the stabilization, the ideological stabilization of capitalism and imperialism, that Japan and Germany after World War II should be seen, or West Germany, I should say, should be seen as success stories. So they were specifically invested in to reindustrialize, so as to compete with their neighbors, China for Japan, and East Germany and the Soviet Union for West Germany. So it was a kind of artificial, it was motivated by a very, specific political aim, and subsidized for that reason. The reindustrialization of West Germany and of Japan. But, Britain had this situation where, she's steadily losing her ability, losing her access to totally closed, her monopoly on colonial markets. And that made the home industries just totally uncompetitive, and steadily, they were one after another, they were closing down. And all of this need to ramp up, speed up the rate at which home industry was being closed down, speed up the rate at which we were able to start to undo the welfare state and social provision in Britain, and privatize public services like and utilities like water and rail and health and all the rest of it. This was what Margaret Thatcher's government was brought in to do. So she, as a person, has become the byword for all these attacks on the working class that were so hated. She was happy to spearhead that attack And that change of tack, that change of policy by the ruling class, and their basically declaration of a more outright and overt class war, reasserting the class war much more strongly than they had done in the last 2 decades, and bringing to an end this period of massive bribes for the mass of the working class. But it's that period, that's what we really have to get our heads around, Garland, is that period of, say 1945 to 1975, that's the anomaly in the history of capitalism. If you want to know what capitalism really looks like, look at 1930, look at 1830. Don't look at 1955 and say, oh, well, look, everything was going really well. And of course, we've talked about it many times before, but even that situation of like, everything was going really well because we had nice fat bribes, the bribes were paid for by pushing down harder on the colonies and rinsing them. Yes, we also made the rich pay tax in Britain to an extent, although I'm pretty sure that the vast network of tax havens around the world really stems from that period when the super rich were like, okay, well, for the sake of social peace, we need to officially have this tax rate of like above a certain amount. You pay 95% tax or whatever, and that's fine for pop stars and all the rest of it. But if you're the super rich, you're going to be finding ways around that. And of course, the government's not going to stop you. In fact, they're going to facilitate it. So, even at that time when officially it was all being paid for out of taxation, who and what got taxed was never as clear as people imagined. But yes, there was taxation, progressive taxation, as they call it, more taxation on those who can afford it at that time rather than on the poor, which we now have much more taxation on the poor than on the rich. But at that time, it was for a little while the other way around. The rich were not that happy about it. But that wasn't the only means of paying. The huge mechanism for paying for this social bribe was pushing down and sweating and rinsing the colonies and stopping, in the most brutal and bloodthirsty ways, their desire for liberation and independence in order to keep the loot flowing.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yes.
Okay. I find this interesting because this comes into this is in the area of people looking for a way out, right? It's like within the system, there has to be some way within the system. If you really believe in the system, there has to be a way to fix things within the context of the system because you believe in the system. Okay. So one of the things happened here was there was a big election and Trump wins and there's all these MAGA, the MAGA people, and a lot of people that aren't so quote MAGA, right? What people don't understand about America, if you look at it, is a lot of people who are not conservative, who don't even like Trump, can't stand him, voted for. I know a lot of them but why? Because it was desperate. They were like, oh my God, Kamala Harris represented to them a continuation of things. And Trump said some things that were different. Okay. And they heard that and they're like, okay, maybe this is something different. We're desperate. Maybe Trump will work. Here's what's interesting that's going on. Trump aligns himself with a couple of tech billionaires, right? One is the richest man in the world, and the other one, Vivek Ramaswamy, extremely wealthy. So this is his crew. This is his buddy. This is his inner circle. Interestingly enough, billionaires. All right. Before Trump even takes office, we have the contradiction of MAGA, right? Of trying to fix this system that doesn't work using the system that doesn't work. So very early, now this is the big thing going on here, the big fight within MAGA. There is this visa system called the H-1B system. Basically what it is, it allows the people in the billionaires, rather than get an American here who, let's say, has some kind of a software engineer degree, they need this software engineer to do their tech bro stuff and make a fortune. But they're going to have to pay the American a lot. So they just bring somebody from a country that has the same, probably even better, to be quite frank, education, but they can pay them far less. So they use this visa program to import cheaper labor, not cheap labor to pick vegetables like they normally do. They just use it undocumented to do that, right? Because now they can pay them next to nothing. They can pay them wages, third world wages, right? Okay. So now they're using this system to hurt highly educated people. Okay, so the MAGA people, and people who aren't MAGA, people who just voted for Trump because they wanted something different, look at this and they're like, whoa, time out, time out, time out. We voted for Trump because we were tired of being abused by the filthy rich and all these terrible things, and we wanted something different from Trump. And Trump's inner circle starts off by saying, no, 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 it's a good thing when we bring in people from another country to pay them less and replace American workers because whatever lie they're told. And the people who are voted for Trump start screaming bloody murder, saying, hey, 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 you told us you were something different. That's the exact same thing. So Trump starts talking and immediately he sides with his billionaire bros. So if you could talk about the contradiction wherein they're looking within the system, we want something in this system to fix it. And before Trump even gets in office, they're starting to find out, if they can accept it, that it's just a little bit different version of the same thing with some populist rhetoric, shall we say.
Absolutely. Trump, Donald Trump, is somebody who is able to reflect back some of their anger of the masses and to capitalize from their desire for change. Obama was a different way of doing the same thing. You remember that? You remember his campaign? Hope, change. He did it in the language of the time when people were more naively innocent and less angry than they are now, but still very desirous of genuine change. They were sick of the wars. They were sick of the decline in their living standards. They wanted things to be better and different. Those are the same desires driving the mass of the people who form the MAGA movement today, right? A desperate desire and increasingly angry desire for change. They want hope that there's a way for life to get better again. But of course, there is at the heart of that a lack of understanding of the system. So it's driven by a hope that there's a way to get the change they want inside the present conditions of capitalism. And even the name of MAGA, shows you that there's this illusion that we can get back to the special conditions of 1955. There's a make America great again. Let's get back to how things were when life was good for me. When was life good for you and why? People don't really understand any of that. What was the equation? What was going on? We've talked about it many times that, this special anti-communist world, this suppression of national liberation forces, the rinsing of the colonies, the USA becoming the preeminent imperialist power in the world and drowning the world revolution in blood in order to maintain itself in that position, and the mass of the workers in America, or a huge percentage of the workers in America, getting a kickback out of that process. That's what they're really referring to. But, that people don't actually realize that, because they haven't been told. And we've talked about that, of course, before, this total lack of a class-conscious leadership to help people understand these things. So you see that desire for change is a kind of incoherent demand at this point in time, and it's able to be manipulated and misdirected very much. And of course, the number one tool for misdirection by our ruling class is scapegoating, which is essentially what the question of immigration is. The immigration rhetoric indulged in by capitalists and imperialists is pure scapegoating. It is in essence no different from the anti-Jewish pogroms that took place across medieval Europe for centuries. The people are angry with their rulers. They are suffering from some particular aspect of the social system, from poverty, from disease, from inequality. Point them over there and tell them that they did it. It's not the king who's your problem. It's those Jewish bankers over there. It's not the system that's your problem. It's these immigrants, right? It is exactly the same thing. It is the ruling class telling workers that another group of even worse off workers than themselves is to blame. Refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, economic migrants, war migrants, it doesn't matter what. Migration in its current form, of course, in general, human beings have always migrated. But mass migration and the way that we see it in the world today is a symptom and a result of capitalist production and imperialist war. And those two things go together. You can't have capitalist production without imperialist war, right? So there's no point saying, well, let's have capitalist production and get rid of the war. You can't. You have to study capitalism and how it works and how it develops into imperialism and why wars happen in that context. Because to just say, well, let's just stop the wars then, they don't make sense. You know, you're not understanding how the system works. These things all go together. So capitalism can't stop itself becoming imperialism because capitalism concentrates and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So it will become monopoly capitalism, and monopoly capitalism will become imperialism. And imperialism needs war, feeds off of war, and it feeds off of racism to justify its wars and mobilize its people on its side when it's fighting its wars and mobilizing them as soldiers to fight its wars. All these things are intrinsically connected, and there isn't a way out inside the system. So for the ruling class to stay on top in all of this chaos, they need misdirection of the workers against other workers. They need the tool of divide and rule. And that is the essence of the economic debate. And all the details are basically irrelevant. There's so many stories and sub-stories about this thing or this thing about immigration, or how it does or doesn't help workers, or does or doesn't help capitalists. Yes, of course it helps capitalism to have workers as mobile as possible. But where do you draw the line? Because the capitalists, like under capitalism, you just can't stop migration of any type. We are all expected. I remember when I was really young, I don't know if I really heard this or if I just heard it being talked about. I don't know if I was old enough to remember it, but one of Thatcher's ministers, Norman Tebbit, when unemployment was rising in the early 1980s, talked to the workers whose industrial jobs had gone and said, get on your bike and look for work. What was he expressing there? He was expressing this essence of the capitalist desire that the working class should have no physical ties to stop it from going where it's needed. And when capitalism is global, the workforce is considered by the capitalists also to be global. When I was going to Kenya recently, I was sat next to on the plane a brother and sister, two Kenyans, who were going home from an 8 or 9 month stint working in hospitality on one of the Channel Islands. And they were going to go back home, spend a couple of months with their family, and then they would get a new contract and be taken back to somewhere else. They're brought in for the season, sent back when they're not needed. This is how capitalism works. The idea that you can stop capitalism being capitalism, when you understand how powerful capital is and how powerful monopoly capitalism, that it controls the governments, not the other way around. It runs the world. Its logic runs the world. The idea that you can vote into power a government that's going to set up a border, and the border will somehow stop immigration, and that stopping immigration will stop this process. All of that is insane on every level. And we must remember that, even before there was mass migration, there was the capitalists used the process of advancing mechanization in the countryside to kick workers off the land there and to create a pool of reserve labor, constantly refreshing the urban population with new influxes from the countryside, which was very lucky because at that time they were killing off workers sometimes before they even had time to reproduce. They were getting through them so fast, working them to death in such horrific conditions. that many of them didn't get time to reproduce, or if they were reproducing, the stock was, deteriorating, right? They were born diseased and weak and all the rest of it. And they needed this influx of fresh, strong, healthy people from the countryside to kind of keep industrial production going. And of course, they constantly got it because, that's what capitalism does. So the idea that we can solve our problems somehow by drawing a line and saying, oh, no more immigration, or no more this, or no more that. We have to recognize that all of this is a misdirection effort, and a very, very successful one. And it's been so successful because we've had decades and decades of it, and it has been repeated to us by every media outlet and every type of mainstream politician, no matter whether they're left or right. They all will tell you immigration is a problem. And sometimes they'll say to you, they'll try and dress it up in left-wing verbiage and say, oh, well, but, mass immigration brings down the pay and condition of the working class. Yes, it does. Yes. What can the workers do about that? There's two responses. Within the confines of the system, the only defense the workers genuinely have is unionization. They need independent leaders and organizations that will fight for their interests within the system. And that means you have to unionize everybody, not a few people. And that means you have to make sure that your leaders are on your side and not on the other side, right? Those are tasks the working class can set itself inside the present system. But even back in Marx and Engels' day, in the earliest days of trade union activity, it was becoming clear that trade union politics fundamentally can't solve the problem, because trade union politics are the politics of the present economic system. So what happens is you are bargaining over the conditions of your slavery. That's it. Are your chains going to be made of gold or silver? Are you going to get a pillow to lie on, or just a bit of cardboard under your head at night? This is fundamentally what trade unionism does. The really positive aspect of trade unionism is it teaches the working class how to organize to harness their power. But in the end, that power has to be used not to bargain for conditions of slavery, but to change the system, to remove the system of production for profit, remove the state machine of the monopoly capitalists, and build a state of the workers, by the workers, for the workers, which is a socialist state with a planned economy. That's what trade unionism's positive side is, to teach workers how to act together, to exercise their power, their might in society, which as individuals, of course, they don't have at all. They can only express their will collectively. But all of this immigration scapegoating rhetoric is purely and simply misdirection in order to keep the working class divided and fighting amongst itself.
Makes sense to me. A couple of just comments before we go. One of the things I thought was, when you mentioned Obama said hope and change, and it was undefined. And people had no hope and they wanted change. So they heard what they wanted, but it wasn't defined. So the ruling elite heard them. You want hope and change? Yeah, we'll give you hope and change. Great, thank you. Undefined. So what the working class then had the option of doing was defining it and projecting onto Obama what that hope meant. He didn't say what it is. So they would project onto him. Hope and change, this is what he means. And now with Trump, he defines it a little bit more. You want change, yes. And I'm not even going to use those words, but I'm going to say you want this, I'll give you that. You're certainly not going to. And now the contradictions are coming up where people had defined somewhat what they thought. Okay, I don't want my job to be taken and replaced by someone else that you can get cheaper. That's not fair. I don't like that. Trump hadn't defined it, but now he's around a bunch of billionaires and they're like, oh, time out. That's how we make our livings. No. And I really think that the Musks and the Ramaswamis and even the Trumps of the world thought we can adjust and define it as needed. We can keep giving the shafts to the workers because they support us. They support our clique, our faction. Now that we have them, they'll take anything. And because of desperation, it's not working. The desperation is getting too great. One of the things I noticed recently was there's been a 20% increase in homelessness in the U.S. Two things, and I know you have to go, but I'll just throw this out. Mention this. 20% increase. And I looked, and they're like, Joe Biden's like, we might have to attack Iran. And I thought, yeah, that's something I could talk about on my radio show this evening in DC. And that, like, those two things don't go to, I mean, how ridiculous is that? Hey, we got a problem with homelessness. What are you going to do? We'll attack Iran. And I thought those two things they don't go together. And then I listened to you and I'm like, they make perfect sense now. The people are suffering and they're angry. What do we do? Well, there's a country over there that has the 4th largest oil reserves in the world. There's a country over there that's loaded with gas. They just found some of the biggest gas fields in the world. Those things do match up. The people are angry and desperate. What can we do? We need more money and power to fuel this system and keep it going. And that's when I realized, oh, wait a minute. What you said, I went from saying these two things don't go together to that's why he's saying we're going to attack Iran. But Joti, I know if you want to comment it, fine. If you got to go, you can just go ahead and jump off now. But
just briefly on what you were saying about Donald Trump. I think, in some ways he has been vague, like this "Make America Great Again." And it's all, you can make that mean what you want it to mean, but we sort of know what it means, but it's like a code, isn't it? But it's not too explicit. When's he talking about? When was it great? What was great about it? What quite are you talking about there? But it taps into a general sense that a big decline has happened. Yes. And we want to reverse our decline for ourselves. I don't like how my life is going now. Bring back what things used to be like. But you're right also that he's not playing to the same audience that Barack Obama was playing to in 2008, was it? Because we have had since then, nearly 20 years of the growing and deepening, what we talked about earlier, this crisis of legitimacy. And because of the way that lies have been exposed, because of the way that lives have got worse, and that combination constantly interacting, we have increased cynicism by workers and a massive lack of trust from workers towards the institutions of the state, in particular towards politicians and media. And so, as you said, many people voted for Trump who don't even like him, who aren't conservative, don't believe in most of the things he said, but they're desperate for something to be different. And they see the ruling class or sections of the ruling class seeming to hate him and think, oh, maybe he's going to do something that they don't like, and maybe that's good for me. Any change is better than this. I don't like where we are. I don't want the status quo. I want anything that disrupts it. Maybe something's going to come out of that that's going to be better. But I think the problem with getting your votes, getting your legitimacy from that type of a movement is it's very, very fragile. And the fact that Donald Trump can't reverse the decline of the living standards of the US population means that, the seeds for the decay and destruction and implosion of the MAGA movement are already deeply planted and growing, even before he's become president. Even if you wipe from your memory banks the experience of the last time he was the president and say, well, everything's different now and he's learned and it's all going to be, all the things have changed. It's, I think, the sense that there's a way out of our problems through electing a disruptor like Donald Trump, it is going to start to come apart quite quickly. That's my prediction for 2025, Garland.
It's funny. I just wrote down his coalition is fragile, right? I was just because I've been taking notes. You've seen me. I've been going like that, taking notes, different things to think about, talk about in the future. And I put his coalition is fragile, and then I wrote after that, therefore it demands quick action. Even before he gets in, the people are so desperate. They're so angry. That means his coalition is fragile. One of the things I believe in politics is a good politician. I studied Abraham Lincoln. You talk about a fragile coalition. The know-nothings. I won't get into it, but a good politician can hold a coalition together because a political party, of course, is a coalition, right? With some similar interest, but then some interests that aren't so similar. And how do you bridge that gap and hold them together? Okay. because he has a desperate, angry, fragile coalition. They're like, you need to do something now. You know, he said he wants to stop the war in Ukraine. When he gets in, they want it stopped yesterday. Whatever it is, they want. And so the pressure is on Trump beyond belief to say, we want to see something, anything quick, even before you get in office. And one other thing, they've been burned so many times, once bitten, twice shy, right? That Trump has all this support, right? But here's the problem. To your fragility issue. They've been burned so many times, they're even looking at Trump with a jaundiced eye. You know, they've been burned so much. They've been burned by Obama. All of these people that support Trump are even looking at Trump saying, you know, we don't necessarily trust you. We've been had so many times. We will give you a chance, but we don't trust you. And I don't think a lot of the Trump loyalists and his inner circle realize that his people are that far from turning on him. They demand change. They demand action. Now the coalition is fragile. Even some people you got people in your coalition that hate your guts, but they want that. So interesting discussion that we will continue. Joti Brar, where can everybody find you online and follow you and see all your good works?
So my party's website is the best place to come. That is thecommunists.org with the S. I have a Telegram channel, Joti Brar. You can see the spelling of my name there. Find me and find my party, The Communists, on Telegram. Definitely the best way to follow us. We also have a fantastic YouTube channel called Proletarian TV.
Wonderful, wonderful. And did we leave out Telegram? You mentioned Telegram. Because I follow you on Telegram and a lot of very interesting stuff, and we can always see what's going on there and your latest videos. Telegram's great for the people that are on Telegram who may not go to do YouTube as much, maybe a couple shows they like. You can even have that on your phone and you can click on Telegram, and Joti's always constantly updating. Follow Joti Brar on Telegram, definitely, if you want to see the updates. And some things I've noticed that you'll put things that you just find interesting or think that people may have an interest in on Telegram. So that's a great place to go. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. It is critical that you share this on all your social media platforms. Share this with all your friends. I want to thank Patrice and the people over at the Greenville Post. That's GREAN, Greenville Post, because they generally put up all of the stuff from Telegram. There's a great YouTube site for those who speak Russian. What is it called? Russian accent, and they take these. So for those who speak Russian, who may have friends that don't speak English, you can go to Russian accent, and they generally, I don't know how quick they get to it, but they generally subtitle or some other way reinterpret this so that Russian speaking people can get the benefit of listening to Joti's great work. Thank you very much. We are out. Hopefully, if I can figure out how to do that.